X. D. Adopted son. A tale of peasant life. From the French of Guy de Maupassant. The two cottages stood side by side at the foot of a hill near a little seaside resort. The two peasants laboured hard on the unproductive soil to rear their little ones, of which each family had 4. In front of the adjoining doors, the whole troop of urchins sprang and tumbled about from morning till night. The 2 eldest were 6 years old, and the 2 youngest were about 15 months, the marriages and afterward the births, having taken place nearly simultaneously in both families. The 2 mothers could hardly distinguish their own offspring among the lot, and as for the fathers, they were altogether at sea. The 8 names danced in their heads. They were always getting them mixed up, and when they wished to call one child, the men often called 3 names before getting the right one. The first of the 2 dwellings, coming from the direction of the sea bath, Bellport, was occupied by the Tuvashes, who had 3 girls and 1 boy. The other house sheltered the Valins, who had 1 girl and 3 boys. They all subsisted with difficulty on soup, potatoes, and the open air. At 7 o'clock in the morning, then at noon, then at 6 o'clock in the evening, the housewives got their nestlings together to give them their food, as the gooseherds collect their charges. The children were seated, according to age, before the wooden table, varnished by 50 years of use, the mouths of the youngest hardly reaching the level of the table. Before them was placed a deep dish filled with bread, soaked in the water in which the potatoes had been boiled, half a cabbage, and 3 onions, and the whole line ate until their hunger was appeased. The mother herself fed the smallest. A little meat, boiled in a soup, on Sunday, was a feast for all, and the father on this day sat longer over the repast, repeating, "I should like this every day." One afternoon, in the month of August, a light carriage stopped suddenly in front of the cottages, and a young woman, who was driving the horses, said to the gentleman sitting at her side, "Oh, look, Henri, at all those children! How pretty they are, tumbling about in the dust, like that!" The man did not answer, being accustomed to these outbursts of admiration, which were a pain and almost a reproach to him. The young woman continued, "I must hug them! Oh, how I should like to have one of them that won there the little bit of a 1. Springing down from the carriage, she ran toward the children, took one of the 2 youngest, that of the Tuvashes, and lifting it up in her arms, she kissed him passionately on his dirty cheeks, on his frowsy hair, daubed with earth, and on his little hands, which he swung vigorously to get rid of the caresses which displeased him. Then she got up into the carriage again, and drove off at a lively trot. But she returned the following week, and seating herself on the ground, took the youngster in her arms, stuffed him with cakes, gave bonbons to all the others, and played with them like a young girl, while the husband waited patiently in the frail carriage. She returned again, made the acquaintance of the parents, and reappeared every day with her pockets full of dainties and of pennies. Her name was Madame Henri Dubier. One morning, on arriving, her husband alighted with her, and without stopping with the children, who now knew her well, she entered the peasant's cottage. They were busy splitting wood to cook the soup. They straightened up, much surprised, offered chairs, and waited expectantly. Then the woman, in a broken, trembling voice, began, "My good people, I have come to see you, because I should like to take your little boy with me." The country people, too stupefied to think, did not answer. She recovered her breath, and continued, "We are alone, my husband and I. We should keep it. Are you willing?" The peasant woman began to understand. She asked, "You want to take Charlotte from us?" "Oh, no, indeed. Then M. de Hubiers intervened. "My wife has not explained clearly what she means. We wish to adopt him, but he will come back to see you. If he turns out well, as there is every reason to expect, he will be our heir. If we, perchance, should have children, he will share equally with them. But if he should not reward our care, we should give him, when he comes of age, a sum of 20,000 francs, which shall be deposited immediately in his name with a notary. As we have thought also of you, we should pay you, until your death, a pension of 100 francs a month. Have you quite understood me?" The woman had arisen furious. "You want me to sell you, Charlotte? Oh, no, that's not the sort of thing to ask of a mother. Oh, no, that would be an abomination." The man, grave and deliberate, said nothing, but approved of what his wife said by a continued nodding of his head. "Me!" de Hubières, in dismay, began to weep, and turning to her husband with a voice full of tears, the voice of a child used to having all its wishes gratified, she stammered, "They will not do it, Henri. They will not do it." Then he made a last attempt. "But, my friends, think of the child's future, of his happiness, of—" The peasant woman, however, exasperated, cut him short. "It's all considered. It's all understood. Get out of this, and don't let me see you here again. The idea of wanting to take away a child like that. Then me." De Hubières bethought herself that there were 2 children, quite little, and she asked, through her tears, with the tenacity of a wilful and spoiled woman, "But is the other little one not yours?" Father Tuvache answered, "No, it is our neighbor's. You can go to them, if you wish." And he went back into his house, whence resounded the indignant voice of his wife. The Valens were at table, in the act of slowly eating slices of bread which they parsimoniously spread with a little rancid butter on a plate between the two. M. de Hubières recommenced his propositions, but with more insinuations, more oratorical precautions, more guile. The 2 country people shook their heads in sign of refusal, but when they learned that they were to have 100 francs a month, they considered, consulting one another by glances, much disturbed. They kept silent for a long time, tortured, hesitating. At last the woman asked, "What do you think about it, man?" In a sententious tone he said, "I say that it's not to be despised." Then me. De Hubières, trembling with anguish, spoke of the future of their child, of his happiness, and of the money which he could give them later. The peasant asked, "This pension of 1,200 francs, will it be promised before a notary?" M. de Hubières responded, "Why, certainly, beginning with tomorrow." The woman, who was thinking it over, continued, 100 francs a month is not enough to deprive us of the child. That child would be working in a few years. We must have 120 francs. Stamping with impatience. "Me!" De Hubières granted it at once, and as she wished to carry off the child with her, she gave 100 francs as a present, while her husband drew up a writing. And the young woman, radiant, carried off the howling brat, as one carries away a wished-for knick-knack from a shop. The Tuvaches, from their door, watched her departure, mute, severe, perhaps regretting their refusal. Nothing more was heard of little Jean Valin. The parents went to the notary every month to collect their 120 francs, and they were angry with their neighbors because Mother Tuvache grossly insulted them, repeating without ceasing from door to door that one must be unnatural to sell one's child, that it was horrible, nasty, and many other vile expressions. Sometimes she would take her chariot in her arms with ostentation, exclaiming, as if he understood, "I didn't sell you, I didn't sell you, my little one. I'm not rich, but I don't sell my children." The Valens lived at their ease thanks to the pension, That was the cause of the inappeasable fury of the Tuvaches, who had remained miserably poor. Their eldest son went away into service. Charlotte alone remained to labour with his old father, to support the mother and two younger sisters which he had. He had reached 21 years when, one morning, a brilliant carriage stopped before the two cottages. A young gentleman with a gold watch chain got out, giving his hand to an aged, white-haired lady. The old lady said to him, "It is there, my child, at the second house." And he entered the house of the Valins, as if he were at home. The old mother was washing her aprons. The infirm father slumbered at the chimney corner. Both raised their heads, and the young man said, "Good morning, Papa. Good morning, Mamma." They both stood up, frightened. In a flutter, the peasant woman dropped her soap into the water and stammered, "Is it you, my child? Is it you, my child?" He took her in his arms and hugged her, repeating, "Good morning, Mamma," while the old man, all in a tremble, said, in his calm tone which he never lost, "Here you are, back again, Jean," as if he had seen him a month before. When they had got to know one another again, the parents wished to take their boy out through the neighbourhood and show him. They took him to the mayor, to the deputy, to the curé, and to the schoolmaster. Charlotte, standing on the threshold of his cottage, watched him pass. In the evening, at supper, he said to the old people, "You must have been stupid to let the Valins' boy be taken." The mother answered obstinately, "I wouldn't sell my child." The father said nothing. The son continued, "It is unfortunate to be sacrificed like that." Then Father Tuvache, in an angry tone, said, "Are you going to reproach us for having kept you?" And the young man said brutally, "Yes, I reproach you for having been such simpletons. Parents like you make the misfortune of their children. You deserve that I should leave you." The old woman wept over her plate. She moaned as she swallowed the spoonfuls of soup, half of which she spilled. "One may kill oneself to bring up children." Then the boy said roughly, "I'd rather not have been born than be what I am." When I saw the other, my heart stood still. I said to myself, "See what I should have been now." He arose. "See here. I feel that I would do better not to stay here, because I should bring it up against you from morning till night, and I should make your life miserable. I shall never forgive you that, you know." The two old people were silent, downcast, in tears. He continued, "No, the thought of that would be too hard. I'd rather go look for a living somewhere else." He opened the door. A sound of voices entered. The Valins were celebrating the return of their child, Xi, Providenson, and Mrs. Ermy. The Story of an International Marriage by Armiger, Barclay, and Oliver Sandys Lady Hartley. Miss Persis Van Ness gave a little gasp. In her excitement the paper rustled noisily to her knee. "Oh, have you seen this?" She shot the Morning Post across the breakfast table to Mrs. Rufus P. Ermy, with her finger marking a paragraph. Mrs. Ermy glanced at it. "I guess it ought to corral him right away," she said, with the merest suspicion of embarrassment. "You see, it's Jeanette's last chance. 2 seasons in England and never a catch, so You did it!" Lady Hartley looked at her friend in round-eyed wonder. I had to do something," allowed Mrs. Ermy, with a dawning suspicion that perhaps she had, after all, run afoul of British conventions, which she found as difficult of comprehension as her regular morning study of Debrett. "But Jeanette—" "That's so. Jeanette'll raise Cain." Mrs. Ermy got up from the table. "It's this away, Persis. I reckon I fixed your little affair up with Lord Hartley to home, and you've got to thank me for it. Now, I'm trying to do the same for my girl. She can't, or she won't, play her own hand, Every chance she's had, she's let slide, and I allow she's got to marry a title before I go back to the States. Someone's got to hustle when Providence isn't attending to business, and as there's nobody else to do it, I've taken on the contract." She pointed to the paragraph. "I own up. I don't see just how, but there wasn't much time, and it was the best I could do." Lady Hartley slowly reread the incriminating paragraph. "A marriage has been arranged and will shortly take place between the Earl of Chilminster, of Sapworth Hall, Wilts, and Miss Jeanette L. Ermy, of Boston, Massachusetts." "It knocks me out," she murmured, lapsing into the Western idiom which a whole week spent in the society of her bosom friend was bound to call up. "But why Lord Chilminster?" She pronounced the name Chilster. "Why won't he do? Isn't he the real thing? I picked him out in my sample book of the aristocracy, and when I fitted the name onto Jeanette, the Countess of Chilminster, it sounded quite elegant." "Then it wasn't because you knew I knew him?" demanded Mrs. Sissy Farr, Ermy's hostess, with growing amazement. Mrs. Ermy's face took on a blank expression. "You've heard me mention the name. That's how it's pronounced," explained Lady Hartley. "His place isn't far from here." "You don't say." "The way these British titles are pronounced is enough to make you doubt your own eyesight." "I didn't know. But if he's a friend of yours, that'll likely make it all the easier. Lord Chilminster." Lady Hartley spoke in an awed tone. She felt it would be useless to make Mrs. Bickens, Ermy, understand the enormity of her offence against good taste, and presently her astonishment gave way to amusement. "Lavinia," she rippled, "as a matchmaker you take the cake. I don't believe—" She paused, listening. "Hush, here's Jeanette." Miss Jeanette. Ermy came in through the open French window. She was dressed in a natty little cotton frock, looked fresh and chic, and only pleasantly American. Perhaps she inherited her good looks and refined tastes from Papa. Ermy, deceased, in which case that gentleman must have committed one serious error of taste and judgment when he selected Jeanette's mother for his better half. "My, you're late, Jeanette," observed Mrs. Ermy, shooting a quick glance at Lady Hartley. At the same moment, both ladies, by common consent, sauntered toward the door. They knew Jeanette's temperament. A crisis, such as the announcement in the Morning Post was sure to evoke, was one at which they were not anxious to assist. "Oh, I'm ahead of time," answered Jeanette. "I've been up since 6 looking for eggs." "Eggs?" echoed Lady Hartley. "Yes, I collect birds' eggs." She picked up the newspaper and let her eye wander along the items in the court circular. "But getting up early makes me homesick. The best time of my life was when I was a kid, when I hadn't an idea beyond the woods on the old Massachusetts farm, when Papa kept his store. And, oh, she had reached the fatal announcement and sat with parted lips rigid as stone, while the world seemed toppling about her ears. There was a long pause. Jeanette's lips gradually tightened, and her firm hand crumpled up the paper. "Mamma!" she exclaimed. "Here, Mamma!" But Mrs. Ermy and Lady Hartley had beaten a diplomatic retreat. Jeanette jumped to her feet, the colour flaming in her face, her eyes snapping with indignation. "Oh!" she cried impotently. Oh! What can I do? It must come out. He must apologize." "Who did it?" "Oh, I don't even know him, the wretch." The chuff-chuff of a motor car coming up the drive interrupted her outburst, and she looked up to see it being driven up and halted before the entrance. Lady Hartley had a perfect fleet of cars. Jeanette at once jumped to the conclusion that this was one of them. She had a sudden inspiration. It was running free, ready to start. There was temptation in the soft purr of its engine. The driver, quietly dressed, but not in livery, she appraised as one of Lady Hartley's motormen. "Shall I?" she whispered, Dare I? I can set things straight at once if I do. Persis will be wild with me for going off without a word, but I'll chance it." She ran into the hall, slipped into her motoring coat, and, throwing discretion to the winds, walked out to the front of the house and quickly up to the car. "How soon can you drive me to Sapworth Hall?" she asked, getting in and pulling the rug around her. The barefaced appropriation of his car by an unknown young woman almost took Lord Chilminster's breath away. He had, at much inconvenience to himself, motored all the way to Lady Hartley's to contradict and sift an amazing and annoying report that he had discovered in the Morning Post. He had heard Lady Hartley mention the name of Ermy as that of a friend of hers, and naturally decided that she was the proper person to consult. But before he had time to get out of his car and ring the bell, here was a young person, springing from goodness knows where, mistaking him for a motorman, and ordering him about. For a moment he was speechless. Then, as the humour of the situation began to appeal to him, so did the good looks of the girl. "Really?" he began. "You see, I don't talk. Get under way," commanded Jeanette. "Quick! Her ladyship has altered her mind about going out. You've got to take me to Sapworth Hall. It's 30 miles. I want to be there by lunchtime. Do you know the way?" I think so," stammered Chilminster. Her bewildering eagerness to be off was infectious. The noble owner of the car felt it. But apart from that, he was quite ready for an adventure in such pleasant company. He forgot all about the object of his visit. Without another word he let in the clutch and started. Jeanette sank back with a sigh of relief. She credited herself with having secured Persis's car very neatly. The man might, perhaps, get into trouble, but she could make that up to him by a generous tip. Her one idea was to contradict and confute the disgraceful announcement at its fountainhead. It was providential that the unknown Lord Chilminster's place was so near, but had it been 10 times as far off, Jeanette, boiling with justifiable indignation, and with her mind made up to exact reparation, would have gone there. "It's awful. It's unheard of. I won't have it." "Who can have done it?" she kept repeating through white teeth set viciously. "I'll have it contradicted in large print by this time tomorrow, or the American ambassador shall." She was not quite sure what ambassadors did under similar circumstances, and she left the mental threat unfinished. Anyhow, it was a disgrace to herself and her sex, if not a slight on her country, and it redoubled her determination to get even with the perpetrator of it. She leaned forward to make herself heard. "Set a killing pace," she called. "I'll make it up to you." Chilminster nodded, hid a smile, and led the car out to the top of its speed. It ate up mile after mile, and as it came to Jeanette that each one brought her nearer and nearer to the hateful person whose name had been so scandalously bracketed with her own, she experienced a feeling of nervousness. The boldness of her escapade began to alarm her. What should she say? How express in words her view of an intolerable situation which no self-respecting girl could even calmly think about? Lord Chilminster's mind was almost similarly engaged. He was wondering who Miss Jeanette L. Ermy could be, and whether she was aware of the obnoxious paragraph in the paper. He did not do her the injustice to suppose that she had inspired it. He had an open mind on that point, but as he was not responsible for it himself, he had a suspicion that she might be. Chilminster had met very few unmarried American girls, but like most Englishmen, he was aware of their capacity for resolution in most matters. Then, again, it was leap year. Suppose, for a little while he did a lot of hard thinking. "I say," he called suddenly, looking over his shoulder, "isn't there a Miss Ermy staying at the White House?" Jeanette drew herself up and fixed him with a stony stare. "I am Miss Ermy," she answered frigidly. The start that Chominster gave unconsciously affected the steering wheel, and the car swerved sharply. "What are you doing? You're driving disgracefully," exclaimed Jeanette. I beg your pardon," faltered Chominster. "I thought you were her lady's maid." He felt he owed her that one. A girl who could announce her approaching marriage with a stranger, Chominster no longer gave her the benefit of the doubt and follow up that glaring indiscretion by a visit to her. Victim was. The imminence of such a thing alarmed him. Was she coming to propose to molest him? He got hot thinking of it. The situation had undergone a complete change since he had started out in a rage and some trepidation to confront Miss Ermy herself, if need be. Now, trepidation overbalanced all his other emotions. Miss Ermy was behind him in his own automobile, and he was meekly driving her at a cracking speed to his own house. It was too late to turn back now. The thing had to be seen through. Besides, he could not help feeling a curiosity to know what was in his passenger's mind, and to discover her bewildering plan of action. Neither spoke for the rest of the journey, and at length the car passed through the lodge gates, swept up the drive, and stopped at the entrance to Sapworth Hall. Jeanette got out. "You had better go round to the stables and ask for something to eat. I may be some time," was all she volunteered as she rang the bell. Rather staggered by the order, but foreseeing a bad quarter of an hour ahead of him, Chominster was glad of the respite. He opened the throttle and slid out of sight as Jeanette was admitted. "His lordship was out," the butler informed her. "Then she would wait all day, if necessary," she said decisively, following the man into the library. "No, she was in no need of refreshment, but her chauffeur, who had gone round to the stables, might be glad of something in the servants' hall." With a foot impatiently tapping the polished floor, she sat summoning up all her determination whilst awaiting the ordeal before her. For, by this time, had come the inevitable reaction, and the sudden impulse that had made her act as she had seemed, somehow, out of relation to the motive that had inspired it. Not that she regretted having come. Her self-respect demanded that sacrifice, but she wished the unpleasant affair over. An intolerable 10 minutes passed. The beautiful 17th-century room, like a reflection on the spirit of democracy, was getting on Jeanette's nerves. The strain of listening, watching the big mahogany door for the expected entrance of Lord Chominster, at last reduced her to a state of apathy, and when he did come quietly in, she was taken by surprise. "I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting," he said. Jeanette stared. Bareheaded, gaiterless, minus his driving coat, very self-contained and eminently aristocratic, the supposed motorman advanced into the room. "You see, you told me to take the car round to the stables," he proceeded, with a touch of apology in his tone. You are the Earl of Chominster," she gasped. "Of Sapworth Hall, Wilts," he augmented, like one who quotes, "and you are Miss Jeanette L. Ermy, of Boston, Massachusetts, I believe." There was quite a long silence. "You knew all along," she flushed angrily. Chominster raised a hand in protest. "Not until you told me. Then why didn't you stop? You ought to have taken me back immediately. You knew who I was." "So I would have, if—" "You mean you didn't believe me? You thought I was a lady's maid?" Jeanette interrupted indignantly. "That was an error of judgment for which I humbly apologize. We are all liable to make mistakes sometimes. You, Miss Ermy, for instance, took me for a motorman. You also appropriated my car and commanded me to bring you here at a murderous, no, a killing pace. And I think you added that you would make it up to me." Jeanette's face tingled. she had come to accuse and, instead, found herself patiently listening to a recital of her indiscretions. But if Lord Chilminster was a strategist, Jeanette was a tactician. She appreciated the danger of a passive defense and, conversely, of the value of a vigorous aggression. Without a moment's hesitation, she began a counterattack. "In today's Morning Post," she commenced. "Ah, the Morning Post," echoed Chilminster, also changing front. There was a disgraceful announcement. Half of it certainly was irksome. "Which half?" asked Jeanette suspiciously. "I have no conscientious scruples about matrimony in the abstract," parried Chilminster. "But I have. I object altogether to the paragraph. I resent it." "Then you did not insert it?" "I inserted? I?" flamed Jeanette. She drew herself up as haughtily as a pretty woman can under the disadvantage of being seated in a yielding easy-chair. "Do you mean to assert, Lord Chilminster, that I—" She was interrupted by the entrance of the butler. "Luncheon is served, my lord," he announced. "You will take off your coat." Lord Chilminster turned to Miss Ermy and advanced a step in anticipation. The butler, with a well-trained butler's promptness, was behind her, and before she could frame a word of objection, the fur-lined garment had slipped from her shoulders. "Thus must martyrs have marched to the stake," was one of Jeanette's bewildered reflections as she preceded her host out of the room, and, as in a dream, found herself a few minutes later facing him across the luncheon table. Outwardly, the meal proceeded in well-ordered calm. Lord Chilminster made no further reference to the debatable topic, only talked lightly and pleasantly on a variety of non-committal subjects. As the lady's host, that, of course, was the only attitude he could adopt, but the fact remains that he did so de bonne volonté. Perhaps because, so far, he had scored more points than his opponent in the morning's encounter. Perhaps also because of her undeniable good looks, his irritation, due to the circumstances that had prompted that encounter, began to lessen with truites en papillote, was almost forgotten in face of a mousse de volaille, and entirely vanished among asperges vertes mousselines. Miss Jeanette L. Ermy, with her veil lifted, and relieved of her voluminous coat, was, he had to admit, distractingly pretty, not at all the type he had pictured as the original of the name. Young, pretty, and charming women. He was convinced that all fond she was charming ought to have no obstinate prejudices against marriage. He even ventured to think that Miss Ermy's mind had become obscured on that point by those, well, indiscreet lines in the Morning Post. They had upset him. Then why not her? They were so premature. As for Jeanette, in spite of Lord Chilminster's effortless ease, her powers of conversation were frozen. She was reduced to monosyllables, and she ate in proportion. It was a humiliating experience to be accepting the hospitality of the enemy, one, moreover, that made it awkward for her to prolong hostilities. Having broken bread in his tents, a Puritan strain was responsible for the illustration. She felt disarmed. Besides, she was rather ashamed of her maladroitness in mistaking Lord Chilminster for a common motorman. It argued gaucherie. Perhaps he thought her unconventional, or a violation of good taste, considered her forward. He had plainly shown his annoyance about that embarrassing paragraph, and that fact spiked most of her batteries. He might, after all, prove to be quite— "Do you mind if I smoke?" Lord Chilminster's voice startled her out of her reverie. The servants had noiselessly retired, and they were alone. I feel ready to sink through the floor," she rejoined inconsequently. He returned his cigarette case to his pocket, looking quite concerned. "I'm so sorry. I ought not to have. No, please smoke. It isn't that. stammered Jeanette. "It's the Morning Post?" Jeanette evaded his eye. "Yes, it does put us in rather a tight place," mediated Chilminster. Nothing was said for a moment. "Engaged," he murmured. Jeanette raised her eyes and noted his reflective attitude. "Who can have put it in?" he went on. "I can't imagine." "And why?" "It does seem strange," admitted Jeanette in a detached tone. "It's not as if we were—" "No," she interposed hurriedly. "Well, what ought we to do about it? Of course we can contradict it, but—" "But what?" she asked, filling his pause. "I hate advertisement. That is, unnecessary advertisement," Chilminster corrected himself. "It would make us, me, look so vacillating." He looked up rather suddenly, and just missed Jeanette's eyes by the thousandth of a second. What could he mean? She asked herself, while her heart pumped boisterously. Was he magnanimous enough to be thinking of accepting a compromising situation to save her? What he had said sounded very unselfish. Of course she couldn't allow him to. What a pity he was. Not an American or something quite ordinary. Then she might. "There's nothing for it but to write to the paper, I suppose," he said ruefully. I suppose not." The comment was dragged from Jeanette in a tone as unconsciously reluctant as his was rueful. Chilminster sighed. "It's so rough on you." Jeanette felt a consuming anxiety to know whether his sympathy was occasioned by the announcement or the suggested denial of it. "And on you, too," she admitted. "What were you thinking? How did you propose to phrase it?" "I?" he asked apprehensively. "To be quite frank, I haven't got as far as that. Never wrote to the papers in my life," he added pusillanimously. "But I can't," argued Jeanette. Her determination of 2 hours ago had vanished into the ewickety. Chilminster had an inspiration. "What do you say if we do it together?" While she digested this expedient, he fetched paper and pencil, and then sat gazing at the ceiling for inspiration. "Well?" she queried at the end of a minute. "How ought one to begin these things?" asked the desperate man. Jeanette cogitated deeply. "It's so difficult to say what one wants to. A stranger in a letter, isn't it?" She hesitated. "Wouldn't a telegram do?" "By Jove!" "Yes, and simply say, 'Miss Ermy wishes to deny.'" "In my name!" exclaimed Jeanette. "Well, you are the person aggrieved. I really don't think it's fair to put the whole of the responsibility on my shoulders," she demurred. "No, I suppose not," Chilminster admitted grudgingly. "How would this do? Miss Ermy and Lord Chilminster wish to contradict their engagement. But that implies that there was an engagement." Chilminster pondered the deduction. "So it does. I see. People would jump to the conclusion that we were in a desperate hurry to alter our minds. And, of course, we haven't." I don't know how you feel about it, but if there's one thing I dislike, it's tittle-tattle about my private affairs." "Horrid!" shivered Jeanette. "What are we to do?" Her tone was so hopeless, so full of tears, that it melted Chilminster. Susceptibilities that had been simmering within him for an hour past came unexpectedly to the boil, and as they did so, the difficulty vanished. "Why need we bother at all about it?" he asked impulsively. For a world of moments, Jeanette stared at him, revolving the question. Then a faint radiance came into her face, and grew until it burned. Jeanette bit her lip. Jeanette looked down. "What do you mean?" she asked in confusion. Don't you think we had better take the consequences?" said Chilminster, as he reached across the table and let his hand fall on hers. Mrs. Ermy stood at the window looking with lack-lustre eyes across the park. She had had 6 solid hours in which to reflect on that risky communication of hers to the Morning Post, and Jeanette's disappearance since breakfast time provided a gloomy commentary on it. She fidgeted uneasily as she recalled her daughter's scared look when reading the paper, and maternal forebodings discounted her interest in an automobile that showed at intervals between the trees of the drive as it approached the White House. But 2 moments later it occurred to her that it was Jeanette who sat on its front seat beside the driver, and, as the car drew up, her experienced eye detected something in the demeanor of the pair that startled but elated her. "Here's Jeanette," she called over her shoulder to Lady Hartley. "In an auto with a young man. Say, Persis, who is he?" Lady Hartley hurried to the window, gave one look, and doubted the evidence of her eyes. "Lavinia, it's Lord Chewminster," she cried with a catch in her voice. The 2 women flashed a glance brimful of significance at one another. Lady Hartley's expressed uncertainty, Mrs. Ermy's triumph, sheer, complete, perfect triumph. "Didn't I say it was a sure thing?" she shrilled excitedly. "It's fixed them up. Come right ahead and introduce me to my future son-in-law." As she raced to the door, she added half to herself, "I don't want to boast, but thank the Lord, I've got Jeanette off this season." 2. The $1 Million Freight Train. The Story of a Young Engineer by Frank H. Spearman. It was the 2nd month of the strike, and not a pound of freight had been moved. Things did look smoky on the West End. The General Superintendent happened to be with us when the news came. "You can't handle it, boys," said he nervously. "What you'd better do is to turn it over to the Columbian Pacific." Our contracting freight agent on the coast at that time was a fellow so erratic that he was nicknamed Crazy Horse. Right in the midst of the strike, Crazy Horse wired that he had secured a big silk shipment for New York. We were paralyzed. We had no engineers, no firemen, and no motive power to speak of. The strikers were pounding our men, wrecking our trains, and giving us the worst of it generally. That is, when we couldn't give it to them. Why the fellow displayed his activity at that particular juncture still remains a mystery. Perhaps he had a grudge against the road. If so, he took an artful revenge. Everybody on the system with ordinary railroad sense knew that our struggle was to keep clear of freight business until we got rid of our strike. Anything valuable or perishable was especially unwelcome. But the stuff was docked and loaded and consigned in our care before we knew it. After that, a refusal to carry it would be like hoisting the white flag, and that is something which never yet flew over the West End. "Turn it over to the Columbian," said the General Superintendent, but the General Superintendent was not looked up to on our division. He hadn't enough sand. Our head was a fighter, and he gave tone to every man under him. "No," he thundered, bringing down his fist. "Not in 1,000 years. We'll move it ourselves. Wire Montgomery, the general manager. That we will take care of it. And wire him to fire Crazy Horse and to do it right off." And before the silk was turned over to us, Crazy Horse was looking for another job. It is the only case on record where a freight hustler was discharged for getting business. There were 12 carloads. It was insured for $85,000 a car. You can figure how far the title is wrong, but you never can estimate the worry the stuff gave us. It looked as big as $12 million worth. In fact, one scrub car link, with the glory of the West End at heart, had a fight over the amount with a skeptical hostler. He maintained that the actual money value was 120 millions, but I give you the figures just as they went over the wire. And they are right. What bothered us most was that the strikers had the tip almost as soon as we had it. Having friends on every road in the country, they knew as much about our business as we ourselves. The minute it was announced that we should move the silk, they were after us. It was a defiance, a last one. If we could move freight we were already moving passengers after a fashion. The strike might be well accounted beaten. Stuart, the leader of the local contingent, together with his followers, got after me at once. "You don't show much sense, Reed," said he. "You fellows here are breaking your necks to get things moving, and when this strike's over, if our boys ask for your discharge, they'll get it. This road can't run without our engineers. We're going to beat you. If you dare try to move this silk, we'll have your scalp when it's over. You'll never get your silk to Zanesville, I'll promise you that. And if you ditch it and make $1 million loss, you'll get let out anyway, my buck." "I'm here to obey orders, Stuart," said I. What was the use of more? I felt uncomfortable, but we had determined to move the silk. There was no more to be said. When I went over to the roundhouse and told Neighbor the decision, he said never a word, but he looked a great deal. Neighbor's task was to supply the motive power. All that we had, uncrippled, was in the passenger service, because passengers should be taken care of first of all. In order to win a strike, you must have public opinion on your side. "Nevertheless, Neighbor," said I, after we had talked a while, "we must move the silk also." Neighbor studied. Then he roared at his foreman. "Send Bartholomew Mullen here." He spoke with a decision that made me think the business was done. I had never happened, it is true, to hear of Bartholomew Mullen in the Department of Motive Power, but the impression the name gave me was of a monstrous fellow, big as Neighbor, or Old Man Sankey, or Dad Hamilton. "I'll put Bartholomew ahead of it," said Neighbor tightly. "I saw a boy walk into the office." "Mr. Garton said you wanted me, sir," said he, addressing the master mechanic. "I do, Bartholomew," responded Neighbor. The figure in my mind's eye shrunk in a twinkling. Then it occurred to me that it must be this boy's father who was wanted. "You have been begging for a chance to take out an engine, Bartholomew," began Neighbor coldly, "and I knew it was on." "Yes, sir. You want to get killed, Bartholomew." Bartholomew smiled as if the idea was not altogether displeasing. "How would you like to go pilot tomorrow for McCurdy? You to take the 44 and run as first 78. McCurdy will run as second 78. "I know I could run an engine all right," ventured Bartholomew, as if Neighbor were the only one taking the chances in giving him an engine. "I know the track from here to Zanesville. I helped McNeff fire 1 week. Then go home and go to bed and be over here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. And sleep sound, for it may be your last chance." It was plain that the master mechanic hated to do it. It was simply sheer necessity. "He's a wiper," mused Neighbor, as Bartholomew walked springily away. "I took him in here sweeping 2 years ago. He ought to be firing now, but the union held him back. That's why he don't like them. He knows more about an engine now than half the lodge." "They'd better have let him in," said the master mechanic grimly. "He may be the means of breaking their backs yet. If I give him an engine and he runs it, I'll never take him off, union or no union, strike or no strike." "How old is that boy?" I asked. 18, and never a kith or a kin that I know of." "Bartholomew Mullen," mused Neighbor, as the slight figure moved across the flat. "Big name, small boy." "Well, Bartholomew, you'll know something more by tomorrow night about running an engine, or a whole lot less, that's as it happens. If he gets killed, it's your fault, Reed. He meant that I was calling on him for men when he couldn't supply them. I heard once," he went on, "about a fellow named Bartholomew being mixed up in a massacre, but I take it he must have been an older man than our Bartholomew, nor his other name wasn't Mullen neither. I disremembered just what it was, but it wasn't Mullen." "Well, don't say I want to get the boy killed, Neighbor," I protested. "I've got plenty to answer for. I'm here to run trains when there are any to run. That's murder enough for me. You needn't send Bartholomew out on my account. Give him a slow schedule, and I'll give him orders to jump early. That's all we can do. If the strikers don't ditch him, he'll get through somehow. It stuck in my crop, the idea of putting that boy on a pilot engine to take all the dangers ahead of that particular train. But I had a good deal else to think of besides. From the minute the silk got into the McLeod yards, we posted double guards around. About 12 o'clock that night, we held a council of war, which ended in our running the train into the out freight house. The result was that by morning we had a new train made up. It consisted of 14 refrigerator cars loaded with oranges, which had come in mysteriously the night before. It was announced that the silk would be held for the present, and the oranges rushed through at once. Bright and early, the refrigerator train was run down to the ice houses, and 20 men were put to work icing the oranges. At 7 o'clock, McCurdy pulled in the local passenger with engine 105. Our plan was to cancel the load and run him right out with the oranges. When he got in, he reported that the 105 had sprung a tire. This threw us out entirely. There was a hurried conference in the roundhouse. "What can you do?" asked the superintendent in desperation. "There's only one thing I can do. Put Bartholomew Mullen on it with the 44, and put McCurdy to bed for number 2 tonight," responded neighbour. It was 8 o'clock. I looked into the locomotive stalls. The first, the only man in sight, was Bartholomew Mullen. He was very busy polishing the 44. He had good steam on her, and the old tub was wheezing away as if she had the asthma. The 44 was old. She was homely. She was rickety. But Bartholomew Mullen wiped her battered nose as deferentially as if she had been a spickspan, spider driver, tail truck mail racer. She wasn't much, the 44. But in those days, Bartholomew wasn't much, and the 44 was Bartholomew's. "How is she steaming, Bartholomew?" I sang out. He was right in the middle of her. Looking up, he fingered his waist modestly and blushed through a dab of crude petroleum over his eye. £130, sir. She's a terrible free steamer, the old 44. I'm all ready to run her out. Who's marked up to fire for you, Bartholomew? Bartholomew Mullen looked at me fraternally. "Neighbour couldn't give me anybody but a wiper, sir," said Bartholomew, in a sort of "wouldn't that kill you" tone. The unconscious arrogance of the boy quite knocked me, so soon had honours changed his point of view. Last night a despised wiper, at daybreak an engineer, and his nose in the air at the idea of taking on a wiper for fireman. And all so innocent. "Would you object, Bartholomew," I suggested gently, "to a trainmaster for firemen?" "I don't think so, sir. Thank you, because I'm going down to Zanesville this morning myself. And I thought I'd ride with you. Is it all right?" "Oh, yes, sir, if neighbour doesn't care." I smiled. He didn't know whom neighbour took orders from, but he thought, evidently, not from me. "Then run her down to the oranges, Bartholomew, and couple on, and we'll order ourselves out." See, the 44 looked like a baby carriage when we got her in front of the refrigerators. However, after the necessary preliminaries, we gave a very sporty toot and pulled out. In a few minutes we were sailing down the valley. For 50 miles we bobbed along with our cargo of iced silk as easy as old shoes, for I need hardly explain that we had packed the silk into the refrigerators to confuse the strikers. The great risk was that they would try to ditch us. I was watching the track as a mouse would, a cat looking every minute for trouble. We cleared the gumbo cut west of the Beaver at a pretty good clip, in order to make the grade on the other side. The bridge there is hidden in summer by a grove of hackberries. I had just pulled open to cool her a bit when I noticed how high the backwater was on each side of the track. Suddenly, I felt the fill going soft under the drivers, felt the 44 wobble and slew. Bartholomew shut off hard and threw the air as I sprang to the window. The peaceful little creek ahead looked as angry as the Platte in April water, and the bottoms were a lake. Somewhere up the valley there had been a cloudburst, for overhead the sun was bright. The Beaver was roaring over its banks, and the bridge was out. Bartholomew screamed for brakes. It looked as if we were against it and hard. A soft track to stop on, a torrent of stormwater ahead, and $100,000 worth of silk behind, not to mention equipment. I yelled at Bartholomew and motioned for him to jump. My conscience is clear on that point. The 44 was stumbling along, trying like a drunken man to hang to the rotten track. "Bartholomew!" I yelled, but he was head out and looking back at his train while he jerked frantically at the air lever. I understood. The air wouldn't work. It never will on those old tubs when you need it. The sweat pushed out on me. I was thinking of how much the silk would bring us after the bath in the Beaver. Bartholomew stuck to his levers like a man in a signal tower, but every second brought us closer to open water. Watching him intent only on saving his first train, heedless of his life, I was actually ashamed to jump. While I hesitated, he somehow got the brakes to set. The old 44 bucked like a bronco. It wasn't too soon. She checked her train nobly at the last, but I saw nothing could keep her from the drink. I gave Bartholomew a terrific slap, and again I yelled. Then, turning to the gangway, I dropped into the soft mud on my side. The 44 hung low, and it was easy lighting. Bartholomew sprang from his seat a second later, but his blouse caught in the teeth of the quadrant. He stooped quick as thought and peeled the thing over his head. Then he was caught fast by the wristbands, and the ponies of the 44 tipped over the broken abutment. Pull as he would, he couldn't get free. The pilot dipped into the torrent slowly, but losing her balance, the 44 kicked her heels into the air like lightning and shot with a frightened wheeze plump into the creek, dragging her engineer with her. The head car stopped on the brink. Running across the track, I looked for Bartholomew. He wasn't there. I knew he must have gone down with his engine. Throwing off my gloves, I dived, just as I stood, close to the tender, which hung half submerged. I am a good bit of a fish under water, but no self-respecting fish would be caught in that yellow mud. I realized, too, the instant I struck the water, that I should have dived on the upstream side. The current took me away whirling. When I came up for air, I was 50 feet below the pier. I scrambled out, feeling it was all up with Bartholomew. But to my amazement, as I shook my eyes open, the train crew were running forward, and there stood Bartholomew on the track above me, looking at the refrigerator. When I got to him, he explained how he was dragged under and had to tear the sleeve out of his blouse underwater to get free. The surprise is how little fuss men make about such things when they are busy. It took only 5 minutes for the conductor to hunt up a coil of wire and a sounder for me, and by the time he got forward with it, Bartholomew was halfway up a telegraph pole to help me cut in on a live wire. Fast as I could, I rigged a pony and began calling the McLeod dispatcher. It was rocky sending, but after no end of pounding, I got him and gave orders for the wrecking gang and for one more of neighbors' rapidly decreasing supply of locomotives. Bartholomew, sitting on a strip of fence which still rose above water, looked forlorn. To lose in the Beaver, the first engine he ever handled, was tough, and he was evidently speculating on his chances of ever getting another. If there weren't tears in his eyes, there was stormwater certainly. But after the relief engine had pulled what was left of us back 6 miles to a siding, I made it my first business to explain to neighbor, who was nearly beside himself, that Bartholomew not only was not at fault, but that by his nerve he had actually saved the train. "I'll tell you, neighbor," I suggested, when we got straightened around. "Give us the 109 to go ahead as pilot and run her around the river division with Foley and the 206. "What'll you do with number 6? Growled neighbor. 6 was the local passenger west. "Annul it west of McLeod," said I instantly. "We've got this silk on our hands now, and I'd move it if it tied up every passenger train on the division." If we can get the stuff through, it will practically beat the strike. If we fail, it will beat the company. By the time we had back to Newhall Junction, Neighbour had made up his mind my way. Mullen and I climbed into the 109, and Foley, with the 216 and none too good a grace, coupled on to the silk and flying red signals, we started again for Zanesville over the river division. Foley was always full of mischief. He had a better engine than ours, and he took great satisfaction the rest of the afternoon in crowding us. Every mile of the way he was on our heels. I was throwing the coal, and have reason to remember. It was after dark when we reached the Beverly Hill, and we took it at a lively pace. The strikers were not on our minds then. It was Foley who bothered. When the long parallel steel lines of the upper yard spread before us, flashing under the arc lights, we were away above yard speed. Running a locomotive into one of those big yards is like shooting a rapid in a canoe. There is a bewildering maze of tracks, lighted by red and green lamps, which must be watched the closest to keep out of trouble. The hazards are multiplied the minute you pass the throat, and a yard wreck is a dreadful tangle. It makes everybody from roadmaster to flagman furious, and not even Bartholomew wanted to face an inquiry on a yard wreck. On the other hand, he couldn't afford to be caught by Foley, who was chasing him out of pure caprice. I saw the boy holding the throttle at a half and fingering the air anxiously as we jumped over the frogs. But the roughest riding on track so far beats the ties as a cushion, that when the 109 suddenly stuck her paws through an opened switch, we bounced against the roof of the cab like footballs. I grabbed a brace with one hand, and with the other reached instinctively across to Bartholomew's side to seize the throttle. But as I tried to shut him off, he jerked it wide open in spite of me, and turned with lightning in his eye. "No!" he cried, and his voice rang hard. The 109 took the tremendous shove at her back and leaped like a frightened horse. Away we went, across the yard, through the cinders, and over the ties. My teeth have never been the same since. I don't belong on an engine anyway, and since then I have kept off. At the moment, I was convinced that the strain had been too much, that Bartholomew was stark crazy. He sat clinging like a lobster to his levers and bouncing clear to the roof. But his strategy was dawning on me. In fact, he was pounding it into me. Even the shock and scare of leaving the track and tearing up the yard had not driven from Bartholomew's noddle the most important feature of our situation, which was, above everything, to keep out of the way of the silk train. I felt every moment more mortified at my attempt to shut him off. I had done the trick of the woman who grabs the reins. It was even better to tear up the yard than to stop for Foley to smash into and scatter the silk over the coal chutes. Bartholomew's decision was one of the traits which make the runner instant perception coupled to instant resolve. The ordinary dub thinks what he should have done to avoid disaster after it is all over, Bartholomew thought before. On we bumped, across frogs, through switches, over splits, and into target rods, when, and this is the miracle of it all, the 109 got her 4 feet on a split switch, made a contact, and after a slew or two, like a bogged horse, she swung up sweet on the rails again, tender and all. Bartholomew shut off with an undercut that brought us up stuttering, and nailed her feet with the air right where she stood. We had left the track and ploughed 100 feet across the yards and jumped on to another track. It is the only time I ever heard of its happening anywhere, but I was on the engine with Bartholomew Mullen when it was done. Foley choked his train the instant he saw our hind lights bobbing. We climbed down and ran back. He had stopped just where we should have stood if I had shut off. Bartholomew ran to the switch to examine it. The contact light, green, still burned like a false beacon, and lucky it did. for it showed that the switch had been tampered with and exonerated Bartholomew Mullen completely. The attempt of the strikers to spill the silk in the yards had only made the reputation of a new engineer. 30 minutes later, the million-dollar train was turned over to the East End to wrestle with, and we breathed, all of us, a good bit easier. Bartholomew Mullen. Now a passenger runner who ranks with Kennedy and Jack Moore and Foley and George Sinclair himself, got a personal letter from the general manager complimenting him on his pretty wit, and he was good enough to say nothing whatever about mine. We registered that night and went to supper together, Foley, Jackson, Bartholomew, and I. Afterward, we dropped into the dispatcher's office. Something was coming from MacLeod, but the operator to save his life couldn't catch it. I listened a minute. It was Neighbor. Now, Neighbor isn't great on dispatching trains. He can make himself understood over the poles, but his sending is like a boy's sawing wood, sort of uneven. However, though I am not much on running yards, I claim to be able to take the wildest ball that ever was thrown along the wire, and the chair was tendered me at once to catch Neighbor's extraordinary passes at the MacLeod key. They came something like this: to Opa, tell massacre. That was the word that stuck them all, and I could perceive that Neighbor was talking emphatically. He had apparently forgotten Bartholomew's last name, and was trying to connect with the one he had disremembered the night before. Tell massacre, repeated Neighbor, that he is all LL. Right. Tell Jaime I give him double mileage for today all the way through, and tomorrow he gets the 109 to keep. Ni HB. B. Or I the Bulldog. Breed a story of the Russo-Japanese War. By Ambrose. Pratty, what do you make of her, McLean? Asked Captain Brandon anxiously. First Mate Hugh McLean did not reply at once. Embracing a stanchion of the SS Saigon's bridge in order to steady himself against the vessel's pitching, he was peering with strained eyes through the captain's binoculars at two small brown needle points set very close together that stabbed the northeastern horizon. At length, however, he lowered the glass and resumed the perpendicular. "You were right, sir," he declared. "She has altered her course, and our paths now converge, which proves that she is one of those DD Russian volunteer pirates. Or else a Japanese cruiser, sir. Nonsense. The Jap cruisers have only one mast." "So they have, sir. I was forgetting that." "What to do?" growled the captain, and he fell to frowning and cracking his long fingers, his habit when perplexed. He was a short, thick-set man, with a round, red face, keen blue eyes, and strong, square jaws, a typical specimen of the old-time British sailor. Hugh McLean, on the other hand, was a lean and lank Australian of evident Scottish ancestry. His long, aquiline nose and high cheekbones were tightly covered with a parchment-like skin, bronzed almost to the hue of leather. He wore a close-cropped pointed beard, and the deep-set grey eyes that looked out from under the peak of his seaman's cap twinkled with good health and humour. "We might alter our course too, sir," he suggested. "Aye," snapped the other, "and get pushed for our pains onto the Terradlind Reef. We are skirting those rocks more closely than I like already." "You know best, sir, of course. But I meant that we might slip back toward Manila and try the other channel after we have given that fellow the go-by." "What?" snorted the captain, his blue eyes flashing fire. "Run from the Russian." "I'll be first. We haven't a stitch of contraband aboard," he added more calmly a moment later. "He daren't do more than stop and search us." But McLean shook his head. "One of them took and sunk the Akandaga last month, sir, and she carried no contraband either. Russia will have to foot the bill for that." "Maybe, sir," But Captain Tollis, as fine a chap as ever breathed, sir, has lost his ship, and the Lord knows if he'll ever get another." "Are you trying to frighten me, Maclean?" asked Captain Brandon stormily. The mate shrugged his shoulders. "No, sir, but I am interested in this venture, and if the Saigon gets back all right to Liverpool, I'm due to splice Mr. Keppel's niece, and the old gentleman, as you know, has promised me a ship. And hasn't it entered your thick skull that to return as you suggest would cost £50 worth of coal? How do you suppose Old Keep would like that? Better burn a few tons of coal than risk losing the Saigon, sir, and mark time till God knows when in a Russian prison." Captain Brandon shut his mouth with a snap and muttered something about Scottish caution that was distinctly uncomplimentary to the Caledonian race. Then, to signify the end of the argument, he strode to the ladder and prepared to descend. Maclean, however, was of an equally stubborn character. "About the course, sir?" he demanded, touching his cap with ironical deference. "Carry on," snarled the captain, and he forthwith disappeared. 2 hours afterward, Hugh Maclean knocked at the door of the captain's cabin and was hoarsely bidden enter. Captain Brandon was seated before a bottle of whisky, which was scarce half full. "Have a nip?" he hospitably inquired. Maclean nodded and half filled a glass. "Thank you, sir." "Queer things happened," he observed as he wiped his lips. "The Russian—" "I know," interrupted the captain. "I've been watching her through the port. She's the Saigon's twin sister ship. That was the Saragossa which Old Keep sold to Baron Dabchowski 6 months ago. Much good it would have done us to run. She has the heels of us." Old Keep had just put new triple expansion engines into her before she changed hands. But they've cued the look of her, converting her into a cruiser. She's nothing but a floating scrap heap now. "But she has 6 guns," observed Maclean. "Don't you think you'd better come up, sir? She is almost near enough to signal." "Well, well," said the captain, and putting away the whisky bottle, he led the way to the bridge. Some half-dozen miles away, steaming at an angle to meet the Saigon, at a destined point, there ploughed through the sea a large iron steamer of about 3,000 tons burden. She exactly resembled the Saigon in all main points of build, and except for the fact that 2 guns were mounted fore and aft on her main deck above the line of steel bulwarks, and that her masts were fitted with small fighting tops, she might very well have passed for an ordinary merchantman. For 20 minutes or thereabouts, the 2 officers watched her in silence, taking turnabout with the binoculars. Then, quite suddenly, the vessel, now less than 2 miles distant, luffed and fell slightly away from her course. "She is going to speak," said Captain Brandon, who held the glasses. "Look out!" Maclean smiled at the caution, but next instant a bright flash quivered from the other vessel's side, and involuntarily he ducked his head, for something flew, dipping and shrieking over the Saigon. In the following second there was heard the clap of the distant cannon and the splash of a shell striking the sea close at hand. Invisible hands unfolded and shook out 3 balls of bunting at the truck of the warship's signal boom. They fluttered for a while, and then spread out to the breeze. The arms of Russia surmounted 2 lines of symbolic letters. "Quartermaster!" shouted Captain Brandon. "Aye, aye, sir!" rang out a sailor's voice, and the Saigon's number raced a Union Jack to the masthead. "Well, Mac!" cried the captain, with his hand on the engine-room signal bell. Maclean looked up from the book. "His Imperial Majesty of Russia, by the commander of the converted cruiser Nevsky, orders us to stop." Captain Brandon pressed the lever, and before 10 might be counted, the shuddering of the Saigon's screw had ceased. "What next?" he muttered. As if in answer, Another flag fluttered up the Nevsky's halyards. "He will send a boat," interpreted Maclean. A short period of fret and fume ensued, then a small steam launch rounded the Nevsky's bows and sped like a grey hound across the intervening space. The Nevsky now presented her broadside to the Saigon, and all of her 6 guns were trained upon the English steamer's decks. The launch was crammed with men. Captain Brandon ordered a gangway to be lowered, and although the tars sprang to the task with great alacrity, it was hardly completed before the launch touched the Saigon's side. An officer, bedizened with gold lace and accompanied by 2 glittering subordinates, climbed aboard, and Captain Brandon met him on the main deck. Hugh Maclean from the bridge watched them file into the captain's cabin. 10 minutes later they emerged, and without waiting a moment the Russians hurried back into the launch. Captain Brandon's face was purple. He hurriedly mounted to the bridge, and leaning over the rail, cursed the departing launch at the top of his voice in 5 different languages. "What's the trouble, sir?" asked Maclean when his superior appeared at last to be exhausted. "They want our coal." "See, teeth them too for all eternity," gasped the frenzied captain. "And they'll blow us out of the water if we don't follow them to Tremoille." "Where is that?" "It's a little island off the Cochin coast, 100 miles from anywhere, with a harbour. Buy they'll smart for this." "Not they," said Maclean. "That is, if you obey. They'll gut and scuttle the Saigon, and then kill every mother's son of us. Dead men tell no tales. We'll be posted at Lloyd's as a storm loss. But what can we do?" "Full speed ahead and ram her while she's picking up the launch." "Chance the guns! Buy!" "I'll do it," shrieked the captain, and he sprang to the signal bell. But even as he grasped the lever with his hand, he paused. "What now?" demanded the mate, his face tense with passion. "Hurry's the word, sir. Hurry." The captain, however, turned and looked him in the eye. "You've counselled me to murder wholesale murder, Maclean. Avast there, man! Keep your mouth shut. This is my bridge, and I'll not hear another word from you." The mate bit his lips and shrugged his shoulders. His eyes were blazing with contempt and rage. But he kept his self-control, and was rewarded by a dozen sympathetic glances from those of the crew grouped upon the deck who had heard the controversy. From that moment he was their idol. The second mate, too, who was standing by the wheel, turned and nodded to him as he passed. The captain, who missed nothing of this by play, felt himself to have been absolutely isolated, but he was a strong man, and he knew that he acted rightly. 5 minutes later, 4 thunderous reports rang out, and shells splashed the sea on all sides of the Saigon. Then the machine guns began to speak, and a perfect storm of bullets tore through the vessel's rigging, some directed so low that they pierced the top rim of the funnel smokestack. The display lasted 60 seconds. When it was over, a very sheepish-looking lot of men arose from the recumbent attitudes they had assumed. Of the whole ship's company on deck, Captain Brandon, Hugh Maclean, and the chief engineer had alone remained standing. There was a new flag at the Nevsky's truck. "Follow at full speed," it commanded. The Saigon instantly obeyed. Before night fell, the moon rose, 3/4 full. It lighted the procession into dawn. Sunrise brought them to a rock-bound coast, and so nicely had the Nevsky's navigator steered that the first headland circumvented made room for the revelation of a little bay. It was enclosed on 3 sides with grey hills, and across the mouth was stretched a broken line of hungry-looking surf-crowned reefs. The Nevsky steamed boldly through the first opening, and dropped her anchor in smooth water 3/4 of a mile beyond. The Saigon, currishly obedient to the Russian signals, followed suit, bringing up within a biscuit cast of her consort and captor. An hour later, Hugh McLean, the engineer, and the lesser officers and 32 men of the Saigon's company and some 2 score of Russian sailors were working like slaves, transferring, under the supervision of a strong guard, the Saigon's coal and cargo into the Nevsky's boats. Captain Brandon was not among the toilers. He would have been, perhaps, but for the circumstance that he had permitted himself the liberty of striking a Russian officer in the face. A marine having retorted with the butt end of a carbine, the Englishmen had helplessly watched their captain being carried off, bleeding and insensible, and dumped with a sickening thud into the Russian launch. The incident encouraged them so much that they worked without complaint throughout the day, and they did not even grumble at the rations which their taskmasters served out to them. Shortly before dusk, the breeze that had been blowing died away, and the Russians took advantage of the calm to warp the vessels together. After that, the business in hand proceeded at such a pace that by dawn the Saigon was completely gutted, and she rode the water like a swan, the greater part of her bulk in air. The weary Englishmen were thereupon driven like sheep upon the Nevsky's deck and forced to descend the small afterhold, which was almost empty. The hatches were then fastened over them for their greater security, and they were left in darkness. But they were too worn out to care. Within 5 minutes, every man of them was sleeping dreamlessly, lying listlessly stretched out upon the ship's false bottom, excepting only Hugh McLean. He was too tired to sleep. He was, therefore, the only one who heard an hour later the muffled boom of a distant explosion and a faint cheer on deck. "They have sunk the poor old Saigon," muttered McLean. "There goes the last hope of my captaincy and Nelly Lane." He uttered a low groan and covered his face with his grimy paws. McLean was very much in love, but he was too young and of too strenuous a temperament to rest for long, the victim of despair. Moreover, contempt for foreigners, particularly Russians, served him instead of a religion. When not ashore, and he soon fell to wondering just where was the weak spot in his captor's armor and how he could find and put his finger on it. That there was a weak spot he did not doubt at all. He searched his pockets and found half a plug of tobacco, but not his meerschaum. A Russian sailor had confiscated that some hours before. McLean consigned the thief to perdition, and with some trouble bit off a plug. Then he lay back to chew and think. "There's only one thing to do," was the result of his reflections. "We'll have to take this boat from the Russians somehow." But exhausted nature would not be denied, and before he knew it, McLean was in the land of dreams. He was awakened by the noisy removal of a portion of the hatch. He looked up and saw the moon, also a couple of bearded faces looking down at him. "Good Lord," he groaned, "I've slept the day out." "You hungry men like eat," observed a hoarse voice. And McLean saw an immense steaming pan descending toward him on a line. He caught it deftly. A can of water and a tin of biscuits followed. He was instantly surrounded by the Saigon's company, who attacked the contents of the pan like wolves. He seized a lump of fat meat from the mess, also a couple of biscuits, and retired apart. The darkness renewed itself a second later, and for some time the hold buzzed with the noise of crunching jaws and guttural exclamations. Of a sudden, someone near him struck a match, and McLean looked over the flame into the eyes of Robert Sievers, the Saigon's chief engineer. "Hello, Mac," said Sievers. "Good evening, Sievers," replied McLean politely. "We're still at anchor. I've remarked it. What do you suppose they intend to do with us?" "Maroon us, likely, if we let them, on the island yonder." "How can we prevent them?" "But I think not. It's my belief this meat is poisoned." "Tastes vile enough," agreed McLean, but he went on eating, and Robert Sievers, after a momentary hesitation, followed suit. "We're in the devil of a hole. he muttered, his mouth full of biscuit. Then he swore horribly, for the match had burned his fingers. McLean stood up. "Any of you men happen to have a bit of candle in your pockets?" he demanded. Silence for a minute, then a Norwegian fireman spoke up. "'Bout 3 inches," he said. "He eats 'em," cried another voice, and a roar of laughter greeted the announcement. "Pass it here," commanded McLean. Sievers struck another match, and presently the steady flame of a candle stump showed McLean a picture such as Gustav Doré would have loved to paint. He glanced at the begrimed faces of the Saigon's wild and ghastly-looking company, and beyond them for a moment, then stumbled over the coal, followed by Sievers, until he was brought up by the iron partition of the hold. He made, however, straight for the bulkhead, and stooping down, held the candle close to the line of bolts covering the propeller's tunnel. "By jingo!" cried Sievers. "I see your game. Let me look, McLean. This is my trade." He bent forward, wrenched at a shoot bolt, and with a cry of satisfaction threw back a plate. The Saigon's company crowded round the manhole thus revealed, muttering with excitement. "One moment, Sievers," cried McLean, for the engineer had one leg already in the tunnel. Then he turned to the men. "My lads," he said, "it's a case of our lives or the Russians, for I firmly believe the accursed pirates mean to kill us. We must take this ship by hook or by crook, and I think I see the way to do it." He concluded with some precise instructions and a few savage sentences in which he promised an unmentionable fate to the unfortunate who made a sound or failed to follow to the letter his instructions. A second later, in a silence that could be felt, he blew out the light and followed Sievers into the tunnel. A few cave-black yards, crawled painfully on hands and knees, slipping and slithering along the propeller shaft, brought the leaders to the edge of a wider space. Sievers struck a match, and a well-like vertical opening was revealed. High overhead towered and threatened an enormous steel crank. Before their feet lay a deep pool of slime. The heat was horrible. "It should be hereabouts," whispered Sievers, and his fingers searched the wall. For a moment nothing could be heard but the deep breathing of the Saigon's company. Then came a slight but terrifying clang. "I've got it," whispered Sievers. "Are you ready?" "Right." McLean's eyes were dazzled of a sudden with a hot flare of light, and the deafening thud of the condensers smote in his ears. He never quite coherently remembered that which immediately ensued, for something struck him on the head. When he came to his full senses again, he was lying on a grating beside the body of the Russian cleaner he had strangled. The Saigon's men were all around him. He arose, gasping for breath. Sievers thrust a bar into his hand and pointed to a line of ladders. McLean nodded, crossed the grating, and began to climb. Sievers, armed with a hammer, followed at his heels. There were 3 men in the engine room, an engineer and 2 cleaners. They took the climbers for stokers and went on with their occupations. McLean sidled to the door across the grating and closed it in the twinkling of an eye. The engineer, who was reading a newspaper, heard the noise and looked up. Sievers struck him with the hammer and flew at one of the cleaners. McLean rushed at the other with his spade. It was all over in a moment, and without any noise that the thudding of the donkey engine did not drown. McLean changed coats and caps with the insensible Russian engineer, while Sievers called the Saigon's men from below. He then strapped on the man's dirk and put his revolver in his pocket. "What next?" asked Sievers. McLean glanced at the engine room clock. The hands pointed to 7:15. "Captain and officers are just about half through their dinner," he reflected. "Wait here." he said aloud. "I'm going to reconnoiter. Just keep the door ajar when I leave. Let anyone come in that wants to, but crack him over the skull once he gets inside." "Aye, aye, sir." Maclean opened the door and stepped out leisurely upon the deck. Before him rose the captain's cabin, the officers' quarters, and the bridge above. Beyond that stretched the main deck, with the forecastle far forward. An officer paced the bridge. Some 20 sailors were grouped about the forecastle door, drinking tea, and the rattle of knives and forks, the clink of glasses, and sounds of talk and laughter proceeding from the saloon astern sufficiently located the leaders of his enemies. Maclean thought hard for a moment, then pulling his cap over his eyes, walked underneath the bridge and looked up. As he had expected and ardently hoped, he perceived the muzzle of a machine gun protruding from the very centre of the iron rampart. Thanking Providence for 2 years spent in the service of the New South Wales Naval Brigade in his younger days, he returned to the engine-room door, and after a cautious whisper stepped inside. "Sievers," said he, "the officers are all at dinner astern. Take this revolver, and when you hear me knock 3 times on the railing of the bridge, sneak out with all the men and rush the cabin. Most of the crew are forward. I'll look after them. There's a Nordenfeldt on the bridge." "Aye, aye, sir. Give me your hammer." "Good luck to you, sir." Maclean took the hammer, slipped it under his jacket, and once more sought the deck. A steward passed him at a run, and 2 stokers proceeding toward the engine-house saluted his uniform. He pulled his cap over his eyes and began to climb the ladder. The Nevsky was swinging softly at her anchor, her nose pointing to the land. On the distant beach a small fire was burning, and at this the officer of the watch was gazing through his telescope. He was quite alone, and standing in a shaded corner of the bridge. "What sort of a watch can one man keep?" muttered Maclean, who had served on an Australian gunboat. He stepped to the officer's side, seized the telescope in his left hand, and as the startled man turned, he dealt him a terrible blow on the nape of his neck with the hammer. The officer fell into his arms, sighing out his breath. Maclean laid him gently on the floor and relieved him of his revolver. Then he slid softly to the machine gun and uttered a low, irrepressible cry of joy to find that it was stored with cartridges and prepared for action. A moment later, its muzzle commanded the deck before the forecastle. One of the sailors had just commenced a song. He had a fine tenor voice, and the others listened entranced. Maclean, however, rapped 3 times very loudly on the railing with his hammer, and the song ceased. Someone called to him in Russian, but he would not have answered even if he understood. His every sense was strained to listen. He counted 20. The song commenced again. 30. 40. Then a wild scream resounded through the vessel. "Sievers is dealing with the watch on the afterhold," muttered Maclean. "Hurry," he whispered. "Hurry! Sievers, hurry!" The sailors forward were now afoot, exclaiming aloud and glancing questioningly at one another. A great many more, too, poured out every second from the forecastle, made curious by the noise. Maclean grasped the crank firmly and gave them every scrap of his attention. There woke an increasing buzz of shouts and cries astern. It culminated presently in the crack of a revolver, a shriek of pain, and a wild British cheer. Then, all over the din, a loud, insistent whistle shrilled. The sailors forward rushed for their stacked arms and formed in ranks with the speed of magic. A petty officer shouted a command, and down the deck they started at the double. "Halt!" Maclean shouted, and he turned the crank of the Nordenfeldt. The effect was horrible. A dozen fell at the first discharge. The rest halted, and after one dazed instant's wavering, threw down their arms, broke, and fled for the cover of the forecastle. The air was filled with the sound of groans. The deck was like a shambles. Maclean watched 3 or 4 poor wounded creatures crawl off on their hands and knees for shelter, and he shuddered violently. He was already sick to death of war. But the fight was not yet over. He heard footsteps on the ladder behind him, and turned just in time to escape a sweeping sword stroke. Next instant, he was locked in a deadly struggle with the captain of the Nevsky, a brave man who, it seems, had refused to surrender, and had cut his way through all Severs's men in the desperate resolve to retrieve the consequences of his own carelessness. Maclean, however, was a practised wrestler, and although lean almost as a lath, the muscles he possessed were as strong as steel bands. Even as they fell, he writhed uppermost, and baffling with an active elbow the captain's last effort to transfix him, he dashed his adversary's head upon the boards. A second later he arose, breathless, but quite uninjured. Severs was calling to him. "Maclean! Maclean! I say!" "Hullo, there!" he gasped back hoarsely. "Look out for the captain! He escaped us! I've got him!" croaked Maclean, with a grim glance at his unconscious foe. "How about the rest?" "Oh, Siganio, what shall I do?" "Drive them forward to the forecastle." Severs obeyed, and very soon 5 splendidly upholstered, but shamefaced-looking gentlemen, 3 stewards and 4 sailors were standing underneath the beacon light before the forecastle companion. Maclean noted that already many of the Saigon's men carried swords and carbines. He watched the rest arm themselves with the Nevsky sailors' discarded weapons as they marched their prisoners along the deck. His breast began to swell with pride. "Any casualties?" he demanded. "2 of ours have crossed over," replied Severs, "and some of us are hurt a bit. But we can't grumble. There are 4 Russian corpses aft, and I see you've bagged 7. "Damned pirates," commented Maclean. "I've a mind to shoot the rest of them out of hand. Just give the word, sir." "No," said Maclean. "We'll maroon them instead. Lower away all the boats but 1, Severs, and bring them under the bows. I can look after these dogs." "Aye, aye, sir. But first 3 cheers for Captain Maclean, lads." The cheers were given with hearty goodwill, and then the men tramped off to carry out their new task. Maclean, whose face was still flushed from the compliment that had been paid him, leaned over the machine gun and surveyed the prisoners. "Can any of you pirate scum speak English?" he demanded truculently. "I have that privilege, sir," replied a swart-faced lieutenant. "Then kindly inform your friends that at the first sign of any monkey trick, I'll send you all to Kingdom Come." The officer complied, presumably with this command, and when he had finished, addressed Maclean. "You cannot intend to maroon us, sir?" he cried. "The island yonder is totally uninhabited." "You're a liar," retorted Maclean. "Fires don't light themselves. Look yonder." The officer choked back an oath. "Have a care what you are doing, sir," he muttered in a strangled voice. "This will lead to a war between your country and mine." "I guess not. Not even if I hanged a lot of you, you dirty pirates. But if it did, what then? You should see, sir. And so would you see that Englishmen can fight a derned sight better than the Japs. I guess you know how they fight by this." "I have always heard that the English are generous foes, sir." "None of your blarney," interrupted Maclean. "Short shrift to pirates is an English motto. You sank our ship, we take yours. Fair exchange is no robbery. You should be thankful to get off with your skins. At least permit us to take with us our personal belongings. Not a match. Some provisions, not a biscuit. Some arms, then, to defend ourselves against the natives if we are attacked. Not a penknife. Sir, you condemn us to death. Sir, we have but forestalled your intention in regard to us. As God hears me, sir—" "Shut up!" cried Maclean. "Your voice hurts my ears." Nevertheless, when all was ready, Maclean commanded Sievers to stock the boats with water and provisions, and to throw some 50 swords and bayonets aboard. Then began the debarkation. Using the officer who could speak English as his mouthpiece, Maclean commanded the crew of the Nevsky to file out one by one from the forecastle, and slide down a rope over the vessel's bows into the waiting boats. They numbered 133 all told, but not a man offered to resist, and within an hour the last boat had sheered off, carrying with its hale company the still unconscious bodies of the Russian captain and the officer of the watch. Maclean's next business was to bury the dead, which done, he searched the ship. He made 2 discoveries. He found in the captain's cabin a chest containing no less than 15,000 golden roubles, and locked away in one of the disused bathrooms astern. Inhumanly disposed of in a tub, the silent form of Captain Brandon. But the tough little bulldog of an Englishman was by no means dead, and when some 3 days later the ghost of what had been the Nevsky steamed out of the bay of Tramoyeux, he was already so far recovered from the terrible blow that had laid him low, but which had, nevertheless, failed to shatter his hard skull, as to be engaged in a confused but constant effort to remember. On the following morning he insisted upon getting up, and was helped afterward by a steward to the bridge. Maclean greeted him with a genial smile. "Well done, sir," he cried heartily. "Glad to see you up again, and looking so fit. The old Saigon has been as dull as a coffin ship without you." Captain Brandon nodded, frowned, and glanced around him. A carpenter close by was busily at work painting SS, Saigon upon a row of virgin white life buoys. The captain wondered and glanced up at the masts. They were just ordinary masts in the sense that they had no fighting tops, but they gleamed with wet paint. He frowned again and, wondering more and more, looked forward. There was not the slightest trace of a cannon to be seen, but the deck in one place had a canvas covering. He began to crack his fingers, his old habit, but a moment later he abruptly turned and faced the mate. "Maclean," said he. The eyes of the 2 men met. "This is not the Saigon, Maclean," said Captain Brandon. "You see it in iron letters on her bows, sir, if you look. Come into the chart room." Maclean obeyed, chuckling under his breath. "Tell me how you did it," commanded the captain as he took a chair. "It was as easy as rolling off a log, sir," replied the first mate. The blighters clapped us into the small afterhold, but totally forgot there was such a thing there as a propeller tunnel. We got into the stokehole and collared the engine room while the Russians were at dinner. Then, while I covered the sailors forward with the machine gun on the bridge, Sievers took the gold-laced crowd aft with a rush. The rest is not worth telling, for you know it. All that is to say, barring the fact that we're the richer by 15,000 roubles and triple expansion engines, and the poorer by 2 of our crew, the Russian captain killed. Captain Brandon drew a deep breath. "What course are we steering?" he demanded. "Straight for Kobe, sir, to carry out our charter. We've every stick of the old cargo aboard the pirates, saw to that also our books and papers. The guns are all at the bottom of the sea. We'll be a bit late, but we can easily rig up a yarn to explain. But the Russians will talk. No fear, sir. They'd be too ashamed to own up the truth, aye, and afraid as well, for what they did was piracy on the high seas, nothing less. You take my tip for it, sir, one of these days we'll hear that the Nevsky struck a reef. We'll have to tell the owners, though what will they say?" Maclean closed one eye. "The new Saigon has triple expansion engines, sir. If I know anything of Mr. Keppel, he'll be better pleased with a ship in the hand than a cause of action against the Russian government. But our own men? Why, sir, we have 7,000 roubles to share among them. They'll be made for life. But I thought you said just now there were 15,000. So I did, sir. But there's only you and Seevers and myself know how much there is. Exactly. There was no call to shout it all over the ship. And I figured it out this way. You, as captain, are entitled to the most. And you'll want all of 4,000 to heal up the memory of that crack you got on your skull properly. That'll leave 2 for Seevers to do with as he likes, and 2 for me to buy Nellie. That's Mrs. McLean. That is to be just the sort of house she's set her heart on these ages back. What do you say, sir?" "What do I say, McLean?" cried Captain Brandon, his eyes big with excitement and surprise too, perhaps. "Why, I say this. You are that rare thing, a sensible, honest man. Let pass your flipper.